Hello and welcome to Console Shock Retro and Modern Gaming Chat with me, Trev, and as always, Stu. How's it going, Stu?
Yeah, going very well, Trev. Going very well. Enjoying life.
Good. That's good. It'd be annoying if you were like, I feel depressed and don't want to talk about anything.
I feel a bit down, really. Don't talk about it.
Not the best. Not conducive to an enthusiastic podcast, is it really? So,
no.
It's probably because I'm back.
Hey,
well, there you go. You've stolen the thunder of your intro. I was going to say, guess who's back? Back again. Al is back. So yeah, Al, you're back.
I am. I've been on a bit of an Amiga kick lately as well.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Pray tell.
I just had kind of like a craving to go back to some Amiga stuff. I managed to find an.
As in, you bought an Amiga?
No, well, I wanted to. Well, almost. I've got a friend, and her father is looking at selling one, but as much as I want one, I don't have the room. But what I've ended up doing is buying the Amiga Forever ROMs, so that legally.
Yeah, the disc that they produce. Yeah.
So I managed to get hold of that and got my emulator set up. I've ordered a classic zip stick as well, because those were my favorite. Controller. Yeah, I used to have one from my Commodore 64. It was the best for that. And I found recently that there's a tank mouse that was made on Kickstarter about 2 years ago. Somebody's done a modern interpretation of the original Amiga mouse, and it's the same physical size, but the buttons are slightly thinner and slightly further apart because they've actually put a room in the middle for a touch-sensitive area for doing scrolling. And it's an optical mouse, and they've even got an adapter that you can plug it as a wireless mouse into an original Amiga as well if you wanted to.
You've not thought about getting the A500 Mini?
I considered it, but again, it's more just kind of like space plugs. There's a little bit of stuff I need to do to kind of get something like that, but I can get decent emulation, so I'm doing that. But I live and work and play with a trackpad, and there's a couple of things like cannon fodder. You need to left click and right click simultaneously. It's a little bit more challenging with the trackpad.
Yeah, I do a little bit of I mean, people know we listen to this. I've got a bunch of real Amigas, but obviously, getting those out and setting them up and everything is never an easy task if they're not just permanently out already, which mine aren't. But I emulate. The 500 is huge, and the 1200 and the 600 are a lot better. But still, you still need to have them set up in the right way. But I do emulation as well, and actually lately I do a lot of that on the Steam Deck. But like you kind of touched upon with the extra controls that you need, it's still not ideal. Like if you're doing it on the Steam Deck, there's games that you might need to press a keyboard key. Like to pause a game, a lot of Amiga games use the P button. So you've kind of got to you can like use the controller mapping tools on the Steam Deck to map like the P button to one of the extra triggers that are on the back of the Steam Deck. That solves that issue, but there are other buttons that you can't necessarily, haven't got enough buttons to map. Really, you'd probably have a perfect experience if you just docked the Steam Deck against a monitor and had a keyboard and a mouse connected, which you can obviously do with a Steam Deck, and then you get a really good experience. But to be honest, there are a lot of games you can just play. Although weirdly, I was trying to play. I used to love the Amiga version of Desert Strike, which is obviously more famous as a Mega Drive game.
Yeah,
but the Amiga versions. Yeah, the Amiga version's a lot better. It's got way better sound and music and all that stuff, and it's got graphics might actually be a little bit better. But that is actually a bit annoying as well, because you've also got the one fire button that just fires your weapons. But Desert Strike, you need to be able to bring the map up, which we used a keyboard key, and then to switch to like your hydras and your missiles and stuff. You've got to do all of that with keyboard stuff. Whereas on like the Mega Drive, it was just like the A button took you to the map, and the start button took you to the map, and the 3 trigger buttons were just your different weapons. So yeah, even a sort of a simple game can be a bit of a pain in the bum. But something like Sensible Soccer, which is another Amiga game I love. That's literally you can control that entire game with a joystick. You didn't need a keyboard at all, apart from to pause it.
That's one of the few, like you know me, I'm not really a football fan, but Sensible Soccer is probably one of the few football games that I actually have always enjoyed playing. It's like the one exception because it's just
arguably it's not a football game. It sounds silly, but it's you're
shut up, Stu. Shut up.
It's not a football game. It's like a sort of a ping pong type. It's probably ball curve type.
Yeah,
not realistic. Not like Pro Evo or something.
I think that's the charm that makes me enjoy it as much as I do.
It's like people who don't like football games. Oh, they're like, what was it, Speedball or something like that? That's brilliant. And you're sort of playing a football game, but it's packaged up in a different way. And But what are you playing it on now? Are you playing it on your Mac or?
Yeah. There's a FS UAE. Is the
on there?
It's really rock solid and robust. It's really good.
Oh, do you want to put a link to that in the chat?
Yes.
Stu, do you emulate Amiga stuff, or what do you play Amiga stuff on nowadays? Did you get an A500 Mini at all, or
no? I used to love the Amiga. It was my favourite machine. I've got so many sort of great memories of it. But I just feel that going sort of back and having the one button controls and the things like that, it'll just be. I think my memories might be sort of, how do you put it? Hurt a little bit from it.
Yeah,
because I'll go.
I can see where you're coming from.
Actually, I don't quite enjoy it as much as I sort of used to, and I've had that a lot with I've talked on here about how I bought a PC from like the Windows XP sort of era, and that's quite good for playing older games and games up to maybe 2007. And some of the older games is actually, when you get into them, they're really quite awkward to sort of play, and they don't have all the things that you expect now in a game, and
you might have to invest a lot of time just to be able to make your way around.
Exactly. And all the the language that video games give you now, and a good example of this, I went to play the Medal of Honor game, United, one of the original Medal of Honor games, and the menu screen was just like an office area where you had to click over the door to go on to the next mission. You had to click onto a desk. And I was just like, oh God, I don't like this. And like, it was simple enough to do, but it was. Oh, actually, it was. Why didn't it have to
abstract
game? Continue settings, and
they're trying be a bit too clever for their own good.
They would do, and then when you get into stuff, and sometimes the keys are. I think I got the game Kingpin, which I remember really liking when I had a PC years ago, and it didn't use WASD. And I was just like, oh my God, I can't play this. It doesn't use WASD. How on earth am I meant to control my character? And, this is awful. This is, I'm never going to play it. And so I think that's part of my sort of feelings about it. And, admittedly, I could get into the game and overcome these objections that I'm really putting up barriers for myself.
Yeah, it's funny how things are changed, because we've mentioned it on a previous show as well, how what it was like when WASD first came out. And it's like, not the arrow keys? Like, this is horrible. Why would anybody do this? And it's just how it has now become the norm. And going back to arrow keys is actually now quite challenging.
100%, yeah. But the problem is that arrow keys now are not set up how they used to be.
True.
On old keyboards. So if you had a keyboard from 1999, you move it a little bit further to the left, and it probably feels quite similar. But now I'm looking at my keyboard here, and the arrow buttons are so small, and on a Mac they're probably even tinier, and it just doesn't make for a good gaming experience, because that's not how you're meant to do it these days.
Yeah, that's just how those old games were set up. Really, they just didn't. They didn't really lend themselves to. They didn't really try and go out of their way to help you. And to be honest, a lot of the systems we take for granted now weren't established then. Like we talked about twin sticks and things like that weren't really a thing. So Yeah, it's just though these things have changed over the years, and we've gotten used to the better way of doing things, and that's just how it is now, really, isn't it? But it does make it difficult to go back to those old games, as you say, especially when things like WASD isn't included and all of that stuff. Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I remember when twin stick, like first person shooters first came out, I was I don't know, I was just in the corner of the room just spinning around in circles and I couldn't control it, and I was thinking, this is so backwards, this is ridiculous. Then suddenly something in my head clicked, and it was like, yeah, I understand this now, and it's completely intuitive. And then you go back to playing something like Metroid Prime on the GameCube, where
it's horrible, isn't it, to try and get a hang of again?
It's absolutely awful. and it's a brilliant game, don't get me wrong, great game, but with that control system, it didn't have the ability to change it. And the fact that came out after things like Halo, it just, I don't know why they decided.
It's not that they chose that control scheme, isn't it? But yeah, it is what it is. Yeah. Well, talking of that era, we kind of landed in there fairly well, actually, while mentioning like GameCube. It's actually a bit of an anniversary, mainly exclusively in Europe. It's an anniversary, I should sort of add to that. But this month, in fact, in the past week or so, it's actually the 25th anniversary of the Sega Dreamcast release in Europe and in the UK. It came out on October the 14th, 1999. So I don't know if you have any vivid memories, guys, of that particular day. I mean, I didn't get it on launch. I got it at Christmas a little bit further down the line. It was the first console that I got close to its actual launch. I've had ones since then, that I bought on day one, but that was the first one that I got anywhere near a launch. Often it was a couple of years down the line, and sometimes a lot more than that with the ones that I had before then. But it's a 25th anniversary, October the 14th, 99. It would have been actually the end of September. I don't think we were ever going to get the 9/9/99 date that the North America got for the Dreamcast. We were always going to get it. I think it might have been something like the 23rd, 24th of September was the original date. But that was what was penciled in originally for the Dreamcast to be released. But it got delayed due to BT, the guys who were managing the internet infrastructure for the Dreamcast at that point in time. They were actually struggling to get it all ready in time, and it eventually resulted in them having to delay the release of the Dreamcast. So BT, British Telecom, could get everything in place. So when you plugged your Dreamcast into the internet through the good old modem that it came with, dial-up, it would actually connect to the Sega service, or Dream Arena as it was back in the day, if anybody remembers Dream Arena. And that was also a big selling point of the Dreamcast, was its internet connectivity. So they really needed that to be in place. So ultimately, because of that delay with getting that set up, it came out on October the 14th, 99. And I'm thinking, as we have had that anniversary now in the last couple of weeks, recently we did do an episode about the Sega Saturn, and that was how we were thinking of how we would save the Sega Saturn, and trying to be realistic with it as well. Things that Sega could have conceivably actually done to improve the fortunes of the Saturn. I think we probably finished up with the conclusion that I don't think anybody could have really got it to be a huge success of like the PlayStation was, but maybe it could have achieved a level that like the N64 did, and kind of be a well sort of a second place that sold well and made a profit for Sega. We maybe could have got it up to that level. So we did that for the Saturn. So now we want to try and do that with the Sega Dreamcast, which I don't know. It could be an easier task. It could be a more difficult task. So again, trying to keep it realistic as things that Sega could have conceivably done. We're not going to just start off by saying, "Well, put a DVD drive in it and make it." It's like,
You've read my notes. You've read my notes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Realistically, it needs to be things that Sega could have conceivably done. And you know what? We could start off with that whole DVD drive debate. We did actually do what killed the Sega Dreamcast. We did that as an episode a little while ago. So we might tread some of that ground, but more in the sense of changes we would have done to, have things turn out better for Sega. So in terms of a DVD drive, that whole thing, I mean, Al, do you think realistically was a DVD drive a thing they could have done with the Dreamcast? If we sort of think that 1996, 97 was when they would have been developing the hardware, we can sort of think about where DVD was at that point in time. What could that have been a factor at all?
Well, I could be wrong on this, but I'm pretty sure that given that Sony make DVD drives, DVD is kind of like one of their formats. I wonder if it would have meant that Sega would have had to have paid royalties and licensing fees that Sony had the benefit of not having to do so. So
absolutely, that's definitely a thing.
Yeah, so that would have put the price of the Dreamcast up a lot more, and also for a format which they probably at the time felt that they didn't need. I mean, you got to think that it was only with the Saturn that they'd first gotten into optical media. Really? Well, that's not true because there's the Mega CD, yes. But in terms of like as a primary gaming solution, like it's like they finally discarded cartridges. We're moving away from cartridges completely, and so I'm not sure it would have made much of a difference because I think that what they may have gained, they probably would have just lost out on financially. In all honesty, that it probably just wasn't even worth implementing at that point.
I think I agree with there, Al, to be honest. And, with the PlayStation, with the DVD drives, you got to think that, PlayStation or Sony were a movie studio as well. So they're going to think, well, actually, if there's 100 million more DVD players in people's houses, well, we're going to sell, 500 million more DVDs of our films and stuff. And that sort of makes perfect sense.
That's a really good point.
And I think, with the DVD, I think it would have made a difference, unfortunately to say, because I think a lot of people were, actually, I want to hold on to get the PlayStation because of, PlayStation 2 because it's coming out with a DVD drive in it, and that Dreamcast it isn't. But then that's almost, it will obviously sell more if it had a DVD drive, but then it would have certainly cost at least £100 more to have that DVD drive in there.
Easily,
easily. And I'm sort of thinking out, the Dreamcast was so innovative and it came out with so many great, like the VMUs, and it had, you talked about it on online capabilities. It had VGA out. It had
60 hertz by default, kind of.
60 hertz, and there were so many sort of great things about it that I'm thinking, what more could it have done? And And that's what I'm sort of, sort of thinking about. Well, what else could the Dream? And the only real shortcomings that I see is really the controller with one analog stick. I think that was a bit of a bad idea. After the PlayStation 1 had two analog sticks for so long, why did the Dreamcast only ever come out with one? And really.
Yeah, I think my thoughts probably, I was going to echo a lot of what you guys have already said, but when you think about when the Dreamcast was being built and basically designed, that's 1996, 97 period, when you look at where DVD was at that point in time, I mean, it had just been released as a consumer product, very expensive, obviously, whether it's, I don't even know if you could really get a drive for your PC in those days. I feel like it was probably the tail end of 97 going into 98 that became a viable sort of thing for your average person. The players were very expensive just to watch the films on. Al, you hit the nail on the head as well, where Sony manufacture these things themselves. So obviously it's cheaper for them to put one of those into their own console. Sega had none of them, didn't have that advantage at all. They would have had to have bought them from someone, maybe even Sony. So they would have had to pay a fee for that, probably a fee to the DVD forum who came up with the DVD format. They would have a licensing fee, so there's issues there. It would massively raise the price of the Dreamcast. I think I don't think you could ever really have had included it at launch. Not in any way that would have helped. It would have probably made things worse. I think it would have made it more expensive. DVD was just, unfortunately, the timing was just not there. The Dreamcast was a bit too ahead of DVD really being a mainstream thing. When you think the PlayStation came out, in 2000, DVD had been well established by then, so it had that advantage. If in terms of later DVD sort of stuff, maybe Sega could have produced a DVD add-on drive, much like the Xbox 360 had that pretty terrible. Well, it was okay. HD DVD drive. There were HD DVDs that you could watch on that drive, and I think they sold a decent amount of them. I always see them in secondhand shops. Not so much these days, but over the last sort of 20 years. I think an add-on DVD drive would probably have a better shot of being successful than that Xbox 360 one was, because DVDs were successful, and there was tens of thousands of DVDs would ultimately come out, maybe even hundreds of thousands. But yeah, I mean, they could maybe have that as an accessory, and even so, you'd probably still be looking at a few £100. Maybe then they could probably bundle it with the Dreamcast. They'd probably have to aim to try and make it cheaper to get both together than a separate DVD player. That then, like an add-on, probably could have success. But then you wouldn't really want to make any games that would use the DVD format for people that had that drive, because then you're potentially coming up with a mega CD kind of situation then, aren't you? So at best, really, when it comes to DVD and Dreamcast, I think all they could have really done is maybe make a separate drive a couple of years down the line, include it in a bundle that maybe would work out about the same price as a PS2, or someone buying a Dreamcast and a DVD player separately for make it cheaper than that would be. And you could just basically allows you to watch movies via your Dreamcast. Maybe it would connect to the modem port. I don't know how it would connect in. Maybe it would sit nicely on top of it and have a nice form factor. And then, if this is real pie in the sky kind of thinking, but if the Dreamcast did manage to go 4, 5, 6 years, someone they might find out a way to combine the DVD drive and the Dreamcast into a slim version of the Dreamcast if they made more newer versions of the console. But yeah, again, we're trying to keep grounded with these ideas, but all of that stuff that I've just said, I think even that is still fairly far-fetched. Yeah, go on, Stu.
I was going to sort of jump in and almost say, I think the DVD, that it would have been beneficial, but then the cost will have outweighed it. But I want to sort of touch upon maybe the games, and I remember when the Dreamcast came out, everyone knows it on there, there's so many classic games on it, but then loads of games were just like ports of PC games that were, I don't want to say cheaply done, that'd be wrong, but there were loads of games on there that I don't really think it quite had the quality that it really sort of needed. And things like obviously Sonic Adventure and so on, and Choo Choo Rocket, it still had that very Sega orientated, Sega Rally, where I think people wanted more. I think PlayStation had changed the dynamic of what made a sort of a good game and things like that, and potentially Sega was still in there. People want arcade games. People want Daytona. People want Sega Rally. People want a 3D Sonic game. And actually, they were good games, but they weren't the next Grand Theft Auto, or they weren't more mature games. So what do people think about sort of the library of games that came out for it when it was originally released? I mean, I think everyone talks about is Soul Blade.
Yeah,
Soul Calibur, not Soul Blade. That was on PlayStation. That was a brilliant game, and but that's still just I don't know. It's not my cup of tea, but it's a fighting game. Admittedly, a very good fighting game.
One that you could play with the fishing rod accessories.
You can.
You can
indeed.
Yeah,
it does work. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like a wee nunchuck almost.
Yeah, it's kind of novel for it. Yeah.
So those games got ported very easily and very quickly. I mean, yeah, the games library I think is actually, you made some good points about there was a lot of ports from like the PC and like some sort of upscaled kind of PS1 games. Although I think some of those were fairly worthwhile. I mean, we had like a Tomb Raider game come out on a Sega console for the first time in years. Although admittedly it was just the PS1 game but at a higher resolution. But that's still pretty cool. There was a lot of crap that came across with that, but there was some good stuff. Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver. That's basically was a PS1 game, but it was a lot better playing it on the Dreamcast than it was on the PS1 because it was like higher frame rate, higher resolution, better textures, and all that stuff. The stuff that we sort of compare, the Xbox Series S versus like the PS5, those sort of not quite the same, but similar kind of people comparing, how things are improved on one platform versus the other. And I think the general games library outside of those ports is amazing, really. I mean, it's not your cup of tea, Stu, but I think Soul Calibur is absolutely amazing and one of the best fighting games that have ever been released. It was a big seller for the Dreamcast. Obviously, those arcade games that Al touched upon, Crazy Taxi, Virtua Tennis, they're all amazing games. There was that kind of thing, where people were starting to go more towards the long form sort of games that were, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 hours long. And those arcade games aren't really going to provide you,
I think that's the point I'm getting at. And I think the question to the room is if, Sega had, Squaresoft or Square Enix at the time and EA, making games and, I don't know if Activision, how big they were at the time, sort of making games and you got, because they were, I don't want to say, they made the best games, but they were certainly very popular at the time. And, you got like the next Final Fantasy on there, or you got, high res versions of, Final Fantasy 9 or something, or Final Fantasy 10 originally came out on that as a game. Something along those lines, I think would have made a huge difference. And again, with EA, it got the FIFA games, but it didn't get any of those. It didn't get any of the Need for Speed games. It didn't, Madden, and lots of people just buy a console because they want to play Madden, they want to play FIFA, they want to play the latest Need for Speed, and that's the reality of it. And they obviously try to make amends with that by having their own football games, their own American football games, their own basketball games, which were in essence very, very good. But what was it, Superstar Soccer or whatever it was that as good as FIFA 99 or had the name brand as FIFA 2000 or something? I'm not quite sure.
That's the thing. A lot of people don't like EA the company, but they love the IP that EA always brings to the table.
I don't think that, exactly. They had a pretty decent reputation in those days, I would say, as well. I think it's kind of in the last 10 years, isn't it, that people really dunk on them. But in the 90s, they made some amazing stuff. Absolutely.
Yeah.
100%. And you just look at it and go, well, actually, God, if they had FIFA and stuff like that, would that have made a real difference to it? And I like to think it would. And then that would maybe brought on more publishers into it as well. And maybe the question is, why did the Dreamcast last a lot longer in Japan to Europe and to the US? What was the reason for that? And I think it was probably they had sort of more games that came out for it, really.
Yeah, I think another element to it as well, and as we're sort of saying, what could they have done to make things better? There's also things that they could have avoided doing. And one of those, I think, if you go back far enough, I think if they hadn't released the 32X, then that would have helped, because the 32X, releasing that when there was already news that the Saturn was coming, and we'd already had the Mega Drive, and obviously in the US, the Genesis, kind of on live support with things like the Sega CD and Mega CD. It kind of soured the reputation for Sega. And, people were kind of like, you fooled me once, you fooled me twice, you're not going to fool me a third time. And with the Saturn as well, not really sort of breaking the kind of ground that they were wanting to, because they'd already had the 32X was a failure. Then the Saturn was kind of really a failure, especially just with the PlayStation coming out on the scene.
The Mega CD didn't help either, I think.
No, and it's basically that was it. It was too many things in a row that by the time the Dreamcast came out, everybody was like, well, Sony, I'm trusting here. Like, it's just been like constant failure after failure. Why should this be any different? And I know that, like, for myself, I didn't really look into the Dreamcast. I mean, I grew up as a big Sega fan, but I didn't really look into the Dreamcast because I'm like, well, again, And so, I think reputation was definitely a big thing. And had they not done the 32X, then it would have only been the Saturn that people would have seen as like, okay, well, maybe there was a dip there. And then they come back with something bigger and better. But I think
they could have survived that,
Yeah, I think people just had already moved on because they're just like, there's been nothing great since the Mega Drive.
Yeah, I always kind of maintain that the Mega CD, I think, was okay. I think Sega could have survived having that, but maybe just that. They just made the Mega CD, that had its little run as a nice little boost to the Mega Drive.
It's like an add-on peripheral. The 32X was almost it was almost branded and advertised almost like its own system, which
that's right,
was wrong. And because they're basically like, here's a whole new platform for it, but you need to have all these other things plugged in to make it work. And then people were also kind of like, well, there's a Sega Saturn that's launched in Japan and coming out here when, like, why should I buy this? And it was just a mess. And a lot of that, to my knowledge and understanding, was Sega of Japan and Sega of America just not talking to each other properly.
That's right. Yeah, I think there was a weird paranoia that all of these kind of 32-bit consoles were coming out, like the 3DO and the Jaguar, and there's kind of the CDI. And there was some kind of a panic. I think maybe it did originate in Japan. Of the Mega Drive starting to look old. We need to do something quick to kind of give it a quick little boost before our next console comes out. And that's basically where the 32X came about. It would just made things worse, really. I mean, people were happy to wait until a true Sega. People people ignored the 3DO and the Jaguar because they thought that maybe Sega were going to come out with something, or Nintendo were coming out with something. I'll wait for those guys because they're the ones that make the genuinely good consoles. But all of that goodwill that they might have garnered, like you say, Al, was kind of tarnished with just throwing all this crap out there that was been and gone in a year or so. Yeah.
You've also got Nintendo, who are constantly pushing their IP for things like Mario. Like, Mario has always been a big part of Nintendo's branding. Sega had Sonic. Originally Alex Kidd, but then once they got Sonic and they're pushing that, there wasn't really much on the Sonic front for the 32X. And then we had Sonic R for the Saturn. There really wasn't much. There was
very little.
Yeah, there wasn't really like a proper leading Sonic title. And so when we did get Sonic on the Dreamcast, that was great, but it also kind of felt like the Sonic ship had sailed at that point as well. And so it didn't have as much power to its branding as it used to.
Didn't have the impact.
Certainly in the way that Nintendo has enjoyed with Mario.
Yeah, I think what you're trying to sort of say there, Al, and I agree completely, is you did need to line up that kind of pre-Dreamcast era a lot better. I mean, we mentioned this, Stu, in the Saturn video. We said, well, maybe let Sega have the Mega CD. I think the Mega CD is a decent, worthwhile venture, but everything else apart from that, they just needed to not bother with. And then we could maybe help the Saturn to get to the level of the N64, which is probably about as best as you could get, considering how big the PlayStation was going to be. And if they did that, that probably means that, there'd be no people would have been quite happy with Sega at that point in time, the late 90s, and that would have set the Dreamcast up in a much stronger position because that reputational damage would never have happened. So you would need to set that pre-Dreamcast era up stronger than what we got in reality. So yeah, bin off those stupid, excessive amounts of failed like add-ons and consoles. That would help the Saturn because people would have a bit more faith to go and get a Saturn. Therefore, the Saturn would be more popular. It'd sell more. It would last a bit longer, and that would better set up the Dreamcast. So yeah, sorry, Stuart.
I think I think one thing I was just going to say is I'm sort of thinking about probably the 2-year gap between when the Saturn failed and when the Dreamcast came out, and the PlayStation sold 102 million units. So there was a lot of people that were like, oh, if I get a PlayStation 2, all my PlayStation 1 games will work on it. And they were unfortunately into that sort of ecosystem. So it's part of what Al was saying. If the Saturn had more of a run up and it did sort of much better, and let's just say that the Dreamcast or the Saturn 2, as what it could have been called, potentially would have played the original Saturn games and then came out as the Saturn 2, and that would have been I think amazing. But I just think in those like 1 or 2 years where PlayStation literally had 80% of the video game console market, that everyone got piles and piles of PlayStation games, which they really liked. They bought into the ecosystem. It was cool. PlayStation really didn't do anything wrong at that time. Yeah. So you want to go, oh, well, actually, I want to try something else. The PlayStation, nailed marketing. It nailed the price. It nailed, having the coolest games. So when the Dreamcast came out, it really had an uphill battle. So I think going back to the generation before, if you didn't have the 32X and maybe didn't have the the Mega CD, and the Saturn came out as a let's say actually realistically a little bit better than what it did, I think that would have made a huge difference, and that would have potentially been second to the PlayStation, or might even better than the PlayStation, and that would have carried on through to the Saturn 2 or the Dreamcast, whatever they would have wanted to call it.
Yeah, I think another thing as well, you kind of talked about it a little bit with the library of games, but we had a lot of people who grew up with Sega, with the Master System, the Mega Drive, and so on. And as that audience was getting older and more mature, Sony were catering to those now more mature audiences as well.
Yeah.
So we're getting a lot more mature games. Nintendo played it safe by going more family friendly, which also gave them their niche. And Sega was somewhere in the middle where they were kind of doing like Soul Calibur is not a children's game kind of thing, but it's also not really that a mature title either. And I just don't think that they were catering to the people that had grown up with them. And that's really difficult when it's your own brand. It's one thing to kind of go, oh, let's cater for this type of people, but when your audience has grown up with you and you don't continue to cater to them, then they will go elsewhere. And I think that's another factor that people went with when it came to PlayStation, is it was offering them the kind of titles like the original Grand Theft Auto that they were really interested in. And the Dreamcast didn't really offer anything at that kind of level. And so I certainly think that some of the game library, and same for the Saturn, again, to kind of keep that momentum going, just wasn't really there.
Yeah, so we have to keep mentioning that Saturn era because it's so important in how it's set up for subsequent years. The Dreamcast was really on square -1, when it started. Whereas if that Saturn era was just a bit better, it didn't need to be gangbusters. Like I said, if it was just even up to that N64 level, People would have been a lot more, and not just people wanting to buy one, but developers. If Konami were able to stay on board, probably might have got Metal Gear Solid, 2 on the Dreamcast.
Exactly.
EA would have kept making FIFA. Yeah.
That's another publisher on there, and I mean, I think we're being sort of, well, I'm certainly being quite negative, but the Dreamcast, you got to realise what it was up against, and the marketing power of, well, the PlayStation's coming out, and that's got to have all the Grand Theft Auto, Smuggler's Run, and all of that type of goodwill going forward. And then the GameCube came out, and again that had all of the Mario games, and it was 4 players. It looked the part. And then you also had another sort of factor, which was the Xbox. And I remember the marketing for the Xbox was, this is the most powerful thing. It's got a hard drive in there. It's got Microsoft, all of Microsoft's money behind it. And I remember so many people at the time were like, oh, I'm not going to get a PlayStation 2. I'm going to wait for the Xbox.
Well, that's what I did, yeah.
Yeah, just because
after the Dreamcast died.
Yeah, it had so much sort of power to it, and in reality it was a bit more powerful than the PlayStation 2, but then it had a different type of game on there. And I talked earlier about the problem with the Dreamcast is it had lots of PC ports. That's what the Xbox had, but it kind of
basically
it did the online right, and then it did had the hard drive in there, and it had 4 controllers, and it was just
I think another thing as well around that era, because obviously, like you said, you've got Microsoft coming out, pushing the Xbox and so on. Microsoft had obviously gone through some antitrust stuff, but as well, sort of in the run-up before that, like in the previous decade. And then we've got the Sega Saturn coming out, and on the very front, slapped on is a label that says, like, powered by Windows CE. And like Windows CE doesn't exactly scream performance machine, it's only something with some capability, which obviously it would have been using for a lot of the online stuff. But to have that kind of on the front, it's like, well, do you want a dedicated gaming system, or do you want something that's got Windows CE baked in there somehow and some way? And I know that for me at the age I was just kind of like, it wasn't really a selling point, so to speak.
Yeah, and it probably wasn't utilized to the degree that it should have been as well. I mean, they did use like Sega Rally for it, which ended up not being a great version of the game, Sega Rally 2, I should say, because I think they just ported the PC version. I remember like some games would boot up with that Windows logo to tell you that this has been ported over and it's using Windows CE, like Tomb Raider actually was one example. The idea was right, because it probably did help get some of those PC ports come over easily, but at the same time, it kind of was underutilized at the same time. It's very odd, isn't it, when you think about it?
You just reminded me as well, like we've already said that the Dreamcast was really good at some arcade ports because of the Naomi platform. So like Crazy Taxi looking great. One thing that Sega always seemed to suck at was porting Daytona USA. So like one of Sega's biggest racing platforms, they really kind of sucked on a lot of the ports for that for many, many years. I think it was until like the Xbox 360 on the online store, they ended up with a version that was actually pretty close. But until then, like I think had they nailed that for, God, here we are going back to the Saturn, but had they nailed it there, or at least on the Dreamcast, I think that would have been not a thing that would have fixed it, but it would have helped.
Yeah. I mean, that was such a big game for Sega. A lot of those Saturn games didn't really get big sequels. I mean, Stu, were you a big Daytona fan? Were you looking for that too?
Well, no, on the Dreamcast? I was going to sort of. The problem with Daytona is I can't. Let's when it came out in '93, I remember seeing Ridge Racer in '94 or whatever, and these games looked brilliant in the arcade. They were great fun to play, but then when you got actually, I want to say things like Gran Turismo, and the problem with Daytona, it just had no depth to it. There might have been 4 tracks, and there was a time trial.
Less, it was three tracks.
Well, exactly, 3 tracks. When you're playing something like Gran Turismo, you're like, oh man, I want to get all the cars. I want to buy all the cars from all the different dealership. Yeah, so I don't think I had the the sort of the depth of games. That's what I'm sort of trying to get at. But I think one thing, I asked the question to the room is, what I think the Dreamcast did really well with was accessories like the keyboard, the mouse, the fishing rod, the arcade stick, all things like that. Maybe if they came out with more accessories, do you think that would have solved it? Oh, Seaman as well. He had a microphone.
Yeah, there was a pretty cool bunch of accessories, wasn't there? Like, the light gun was pretty good.
Light gun was brilliant, yeah.
Yeah, it was a really good light gun. I mean, the PS2 did get one eventually, and you got like Virtua Cop, didn't you, and things like that, which actually were pretty good light gun games. But I mean, it had like the fishing rod controller. I mean, obviously there was a keyboard and a mouse as well, because obviously the internet connectivity was a big thing with the Dreamcast. Probably one of the biggest selling points, but unfortunately, it didn't actually massively help in the long run, did it? In terms of the amount of people that bought one.
I would argue that the Dreamcast has probably enjoyed the best selection of accessories for any games console.
Yeah, that's fair.
I think that they had a massive variety, and they were all pretty rock solid accessories for the most part. And in a way that like Xbox had Kinect, and it was kind of really a dismal failure overall. Yeah, and there's so many things that were gimmicky. But I think they pretty much nailed it with that. I think if they'd added more, could that have diluted and got to a point where you were getting to some just really gimmicky stuff which weren't as good? Possibly.
Yeah, the only thing that I would really would have suggested as an additional accessory, I don't think there's really many more they could have come up with. I think it had everything it needed, really.
So much
would have been something like a DVD drive, but we've already
I'm actually going to say
how difficult that would have been.
And this did come out, but this should have been on every console, was an Ethernet port, so a broadband adapter.
Yeah. They got that in North America, but we didn't get it here, I don't think, no.
No, you could get them. But I think, because the online, I remember playing the online, and then it was, you talk about, you watch a Digital Foundry and video, and they talk about, it's a bit lagging. I mean, I thought it was impossible to play.
I used to play Choo Choo Rocket online on the Dreamcast.
You couldn't play Quake 3 Arena, could you?
Not well. I mean, Choo Choo Rocket, you would place your arrow on the sort of the board or whatever it is, the sort of the ground. It would take like about a second for you to hit the button and for the arrow to appear, whereas obviously it was instant. So yeah, even for a fairly basic game like Choo Choo Rocket, there was that huge amount of delay. But
it was just 56k dial-up, wasn't it?
I think it was less in the UK. It was 56 in Japan and America. Yeah, it was 33. I don't know why they did that. I don't know why they downgraded it for the UK, but I think the rest of Europe as well. But yeah, that didn't help either, right? Even that extra few K would have been a big difference.
Maybe BT were worried about how it could hammer. Maybe they were expecting that the Dreamcast could actually be wildly successful and could hamper their network quite badly from the projections that they were getting.
That's a good point. Yeah.
But I just think if they had, a proper sort of broadband service on there, and it came out with, look, you can play, what's it called? Quake 3 Arena, Phantasy Star Online, and actually sort of play them sort of properly as they're meant to be played on the PC. And then there are more games around that. I think that would have been a much better sort of offering, and just try to get into the online world. And I think they did, but I'd argue they didn't do it properly. And
I mean,
a modem is just
yeah. I mean, my experience. I mean, I used the internet side of the Dreamcast heavily, so I kind of got first-hand experience, and I actually really enjoyed it. Not so much the gaming side, funnily enough. Like I said, mainly Choo Choo Rocket I think that was the first online-enabled game in the UK. Like the US and Japan, I think had way more. I think we could play like Quake 3 Arena. I think I might have tried that once or twice. Yeah, but I think for me it was mainly because I had quite a rickety old hand-me-down PC at that point in time that I used for the internet. So from that point on, I started just going on the internet using my Dreamcast. I bought the keyboard. It was fairly easy to navigate the internet. It supported a lot of the standards of the time, like there was a version, whatever version of Flash, it could do that. Up till sort of 99, 2000. And it was a lot faster and smoother than on my PC because, the performance increase, the hand-me-down PC I had was like a bloody 486 or something I was using at home, whereas this is like equivalent to like a fairly decent sort of Pentium 2. I would say the Dreamcast would have been around the same as, or maybe even a bit better than that, with the graphics hardware it had to render the pages and all of that stuff that a PC might not have. So the experience was pretty decent, and like the online sort of the hub Dream Arena, that was pretty cool. It had all the latest sort of Sega news, and you had an email account you had with it that I would use. Even my dad started using it because he found it less clunky than using the PC. He would use that for his email. And you could buy, there was a store, I think, as well, where you could buy controllers and keyboards and I think games. So it was actually fairly decent. I'm not sure what they could have done better at that time with the technology that was available. I mean, the Xbox benefited from doing it 5 years later, really. Broadband where I lived wasn't available until like 2004. So, you weren't really going to get anything faster out of a Dreamcast anyway.
Actually, that's a really good point, Trev. I'm going, they should have... I think this is in an ideal world. The infrastructure for broadband would have been... I don't think there was the infrastructure. I
mean, you're kind of... I guess your argument is basically maybe they shouldn't have bothered at all and just used that money that they spent because the technology just wasn't there, I think is what you're saying. Maybe use that money to put into another aspect of the Dreamcast.
Well, that's the point, isn't it, Jeff? So maybe if they didn't put a modem onto every unit, which was, probably 1 in 20 people used, if and actually invested that into, a twin stick controller or potentially towards a DVD drive, I
maybe
think would have made a sort of a huge sort of difference to the console.
I'm also curious because I don't know the answer to this, but obviously Sega would have been developing it primarily for their Japanese market, and I wonder what the Japanese network infrastructure was like back then. And perhaps in Japan it would have been more capable for that kind of stuff, whereas the UK evidently wasn't quite ready for it.
I would probably say it would be better than what we had here. They had quite a lot of online capable games. But then the Saturn had its own, the Netlink, wasn't it? I think had its own modem as well. So actually there was even, they had an even earlier version of this stuff going on the Saturn. So I think they probably got excited by, their first attempt on the Saturn and kind of ran with it for the Dreamcast, I guess. But I think it's a good point, Al.
If they had it as a standalone accessory to add it, then they'd probably be thinking, well, then people probably wouldn't buy it and wouldn't use it. And then they're losing a load. It probably would have actually harmed them even more. So I would imagine their thinking was, if we include it, everybody's going to use it. It's going to give us a better return on investment in that regard. So there's definitely a lot of factors to it. and it's definitely easy to see why they went with that decision. But for the UK market specifically, I think that omitting it may have been better. But you can't just omit it from the UK market and not have it everywhere else. Or even the European market, like to have network capability in the US and Japan and not Europe, that would have hampered it too. It's a really tough thing, really, because it seems like a delicate balance.
It's difficult to know. Yeah, it's difficult to know how to handle that, the sort of the internet side of the Dreamcast, because I think it was worthwhile ultimately. Like I said, I had a pretty good experience, even though I wasn't playing loads of games with it. But it kind of ended up the sort of Dreamcast internet sort of ended up it had to die to make the Xbox One viable. Is probably one way you could look at it. But you're right, Al. We all were reading about the Dreamcast in the magazines and how they were going to have it available straight away from day one with a modem included. That was a huge selling point that other consoles couldn't offer at all. So it was literally a USP.
And the internet was really blowing up. Internet was blowing up back then as well.
Exactly. So
there's so much growth really quickly.
Yeah, and online gaming was as well. So on paper, it actually kind of was, and it wasn't good timing. Ultimately, the infrastructure might have been a bit behind, as we're kind of speculating. But yeah, they couldn't really have launched it without that modem. I think a lot of people would have been very upset. I think I was looking forward to having something that was internet capable, that I could play, browse the internet on my TV, and also game on potentially. I think we're all looking forward to that in the Dreamcast. So I don't think they basically, it might have been a rod for their own back that they made a little bit. And it's a case of they kind of made their bed and they had to lie in it, really. And they did, but yeah, kind of the infrastructure didn't really support it. But I don't think they could have left it out, really. I think I probably would have kept it the same. As much as we're trying to come up with stuff that would have helped them, I think removing that would have probably been for the worse. So I couldn't tell you how they could have improved it. I mean, Stu, you're probably right. Keeping that faster modem in there probably would have been better. I mean, 56K modems are pretty much the norm by 98, 99 anyway.
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
Some people had like ISDN lines as well, who were kind of a thing that was happening, which were a little bit quicker than dial-up.
It potentially would have future-proofed it a little bit better.
Yeah. I mean, it was already good the way they made it a modular part of the Dreamcast. You could pop it out from the side, and obviously people would. There was the broadband modem that they got in Japan and America that you could plug back in there. So yeah, the internet whole situation. Sega, I don't think it really mucked anything up with that. I think I probably would have kept it. I mean, would you guys have kept the internet capability in there as it was? Would you have taken it out? How would you have handled that?
I think I would have, for the sake of the conversation, I would have taken it out because, for one, I didn't use it. And
when did you get your Dreamcast? Was it like during its heyday, or
no? It was probably maybe 6 months after it came out.
Okay, yeah.
Someone was, I think, in a local paper, someone was selling one for cheap. And
right.
I remember getting it, and actually it's quite funny. This might be the reason why I never went on the internet with it. But I remember buying it, and it didn't have the modem.
Oh wow, the little unit wasn't in there.
It wasn't in there. But I had a PC, and I think I did all browsing on there. So I don't think I would have potentially have used. Maybe never say never, but
yeah.
So the fact that it didn't actually have it, but then years later, I bought a Dreamcast again, and it did have it, and it was long gone. You going online, so I just think it was a great idea. It was the first one to do it. It was really innovative, but it was like the Apple Vision Pro. It's everyone thinks it's a brilliant idea, but it probably hasn't sold 1 million units and things like that because it's a little bit ahead of its time.
Probably the Virtual Boy, I think, could be a good analogy.
Like the video game, or something like that. It was, maybe if the Dreamcast came out a year later and everything else came out a year later, and it had the broadband, it had a better infrastructure, it had. More games that utilized it, and I mean, on the positive of online, there's a YouTuber called the Happy Console Gamer, and he speaks so fondly about playing Phantasy Star Online for 1 million hours online on his Dreamcast, and he had all his friends on there, and he had the keyboards and.
Oh, that guy, he's got the weirdest he played every big game. He got every big game that ever came out, and he just had like the most perfect experience with everything. It's almost infuriating listening to him. You know what I mean? Trev, it's like I was like,
leave him alone. He's a Happy Console Gamer. You can have a go at Metal Jesus, but do not have a go at him.
Can't have a go at Metal Jesus.
Yeah, you can. Oh, bloody Metal Jesus.
Al, I mean,
you ever want to be on the show? DM us.
Yeah. No
charge. Happy
now.
Console Gamer. DM us. You're always welcome on the show.
Oh, of course.
It's always a fresh of breath air to have somebody positive on the internet as well, because the internet is not a very positive place these days.
Exactly. So I think he had a really great experience playing online on the Dreamcast with things like Phantasy Star, and if he had a good time, I'm sure I would have done if I got into it and had the right setup.
Al, what are your thoughts on that sort of Dreamcast internet situation? Yeah, would you have kept that functionality in there? Would you have taken it out? Would you have done something different?
I think as they were trying to push things forward, I think they were right to keep it in. I'm still surprised that it was 33. I think a 56K modem probably would have been better, especially just kind of, at least for longevity. If you're not going to put anything faster than that in, at least 56K at that time. But again, I don't even know what that would have made to the if that would have changed the price a lot. Maybe it was just that they were able to get hold of a lot of older 33K modems that
they got a better deal or something.
Yeah, that's it. And maybe they were just kind of like, for the number of people that might use it, this might still be more beneficial. I don't think Sega were financially in the best place then. And because back in the day when it was like an actual console being released, I only knew one person who had one. And I remember going over to their house and they were showing it to me and they were like, it's got a modem built in. I'm like, a modem? You're like, yeah, you can go on the internet. I'm like, cool, what's that like? Never been on it.
My mom won't let me.
That was it. Yeah, they were just kind of happy that the option was there. The option was there, but they never actually got online with it, But and I don't know what it was like for the service in the UK. You could probably attest to it better, Trev. But I know that in the US, I've heard that they tried to make it that if you subscribe to, I think it was SegaNet at that time, the console you would get for free. And they still couldn't even shift units, even with that kind of deal, which sounds like a pretty sweet deal.
Yeah, I mean, it does. I've heard of that. Yeah, we didn't have anything like that in the UK.
I didn't think there was. Yeah.
I mean, I can't remember how when you dialed into a BT Internet kind of server. I don't know if you had to sort of set up an account with BT Internet and pay them like a fee, or if it was free. I think that might have been free, and you just paid your phone bill basically. But obviously, it was dial-up, so you'd wipe out your phone.
Oh, so a little bit like internet. So a little bit like when FreeServe first launched.
Exactly, yeah. It was exactly the same kind of technique, effectively, and then you're online with the Dreamcast. But I think if we'll move on from the internet sort of situation. If that's a complicated one, I think the final thing really before we finish, because we've already gone over the hour, is there was a lot of marketing money spent on kind of slightly frivolous things that perhaps could have been done better. I mean, the adverts, you can look them up on YouTube if you don't remember them, but they were fairly they didn't really showcase enough of the graphics and the games. And this was at a point in time where there was a big jump between one generation to the next. And you could clearly see, that there were games coming out on whatever new console that was coming out that you couldn't do on the old one. So I think the advertising really should have emphasized that a lot more. They're probably trying to be a bit too grungy and a bit too clever with the advertising, and they didn't really have a lot of footage of the game. So I think that's something I would change to really help market the console. And also just like spending way too much money on sponsoring football clubs. I mean, I know, you'll laugh at this, Stu, because you're an Arsenal fan, but they obviously would have paid a lot of money for Arsenal to get Dreamcast on the kit. And obviously it's kind of cool having that brand on there, but realistically, I mean, God, is that money that could have been spent on something else? Perhaps, I mean, they sponsored 4 or 5 teams, I think, throughout Europe. It wasn't just Arsenal. It might have been worthwhile having one of them, probably Arsenal, because of the how that brings marketing in itself, being a London-based team and just the Premier League and everything, being internationally, even in those days, a thing that people around the world watched. But, I maybe let them have that one team. But the rest of the budget, to be honest, that could have been spent on better advertising, maybe getting more units available to the parts of Europe that had to wait longer for their console, maybe putting the better modem in that we've speculated, Al. It could have been spent on that. Just in other ways that would have been better support. I mean, if they had to pay some fees to developers to join or to persuade them, that's probably good use of that money, I think.
That's what I was going to say, Trev. Yeah.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on that, Stu? Obviously, as a football fan as well.
Well, that's it. I mean, as a football fan, I've got my gold Arsenal shirt which says Sega on the front, and I love that. But you got to think about the money behind that, and they're going, oh yeah, we're going to advertise all these football games, all all these football clubs. Oh yeah, but FIFA's not coming out. It's
really ridiculous.
It doesn't make sense. And I know they have their own football games, but they take a while to sort of. But it's a bigger picture. They should have. You mentioned Konami. They should have had. I know they had Capcom on there. They should have had EA. They should have had all these other different sort of publishers on there making their games, and that money that they potentially spent on Arsenal, which thank you very much appreciated it.
Yeah,
it should have been better to get these guys on board and get some exclusive games onto their system, and that would have made the difference.
And I think we touched upon it a fair amount already, but the games obviously is a big factor, and that money probably would have helped out with that. But I think, if they navigated that pre-Dreamcast era, they probably would have been able to maintain a good relationship with EA. And, we really can't, emphasize enough how important it would have been to get a good football game on the Dreamcast, because a big thing that you hear when Americans talk about, perhaps Canadians as well, Al, you might be able to speak to that, but they always say a great thing about the Dreamcast was it had a really good NBA game and it had a really good NFL game, because Sega were able to get those made. They developed a couple of really good series, both of which are one of which is still running, the NBA 2K games, but the first iteration of that was on the Dreamcast, and NFL 2K was really good as well, and was actually better than the EA sports games. So that was a great selling point in those territories. But in Europe, where soccer is the biggest thing, and parts of probably South America and other places where they would want to market the Dreamcast, we got Virtua Striker 2, which I like. It's a fun kind of very arcadey. Well, it is literally an arcade football game.
Arcadey, you've hit the nail on the head. That's not what people wanted.
No, that's not what people were getting used to playing. ISS Pro on the PS1, which is a really great football game. I was still playing that when I had my Dreamcast. I would play my PS1 stayed set up, with my Dreamcast, so I could play that game because there was nothing like it on the Dreamcast. FIFA was still fun. There was nothing like that on the Dreamcast. If it got FIFA 99 or 2000, probably would have been the one it would have got. That could have been huge, especially if it was a sort of an upgraded version from the PS1 version, which it would have been able to do. Because at 60 frames a second, with much higher resolution, the game would run in 640 by 480, So that would have been a huge thing in Europe. And basically to finish, have you got any final thoughts, Al, on helping the Dreamcast to survive?
I kind of want to go back to what you were saying about the advertising. I thought the advertising sucked. They really could have done a better job, because I remember there was so much going on about things like the GameCube, about the PlayStation 2, and Dreamcast. You didn't really hear much about, in all honesty. I didn't really
outside
hear
of gaming circles. Nothing.
You didn't really get much of it until really it was too late. The ship had already sailed, and I think they were already struggling by the time the public were really being involved in the conversation as to there's this Dreamcast out. It just seems so lackluster, and there just wasn't much hype or excitement about it. And I think that's partly down to the advertising, and then just partly down to the reputation that Sega had dug for themselves. And I'm saying that as somebody who is a big Sega fan and grew up with Sega.
A good example of just it's kind of an anecdotal thing, which how reliable are they really? But my girlfriend was into video games. She had a PlayStation 1, during its heyday. She never heard of a Dreamcast till I showed her the Dreamcast when we started dating. She thought it was really cool when the games were like, wow, these are really round, and this was doing this in 1999. Oh my god, that's really cool. She never heard of it, Yeah. Which is, which is fairly common, I would say, with people that aren't super hardcore into games and just had their PS1. They were happy with that, and perhaps they didn't buy the magazines and do all that. They just walked into Virgin Megastore, and that was where they saw what the latest games are, or Woolworths. You could get the Dreamcast in these shops, but it was probably maybe a single gondola. You worked, in video games retail closer to that era, Stu. What do you recall from its presence on sort of high street, stuff?
It was very. I think when I worked at Game, it was in its last legs, and at the front of the store was the big display of PlayStation 2s, and there were games like. Was it Crazy Taxi was out on the PlayStation 2, and everyone wanted a PlayStation 2. And at the back of the store, unfortunately, the Dreamcast was $99.99. It was a third of the price of the PlayStation 2, and a few people came in to buy games, but everyone was. Oh, do you know how to, and I put a little note in there. Do you know how to do the piracy on it? Do you know where do I get games from? And sort of things like that. And it lost all of its, all of its hype by the time I was working, in the video game store at the time. And, everyone was, hyped about the PlayStation 2. Rightly so. It was a brilliant machine. Nothing wrong with it.
I'm not one of those people that is like, the wrong console won, screw the PS2. No, we needed the PS2
brilliant.
To come out. Yeah,
you can
amazing games.
You can have two brilliants. You can have three brilliants.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Exactly. But
yeah. Well, it was a tragic tale, wasn't it, the Dreamcast? And you know what? I don't think it could realistically, if we, like I said, we're trying to keep it grounded. I don't really think we could ever have got it to a point where it would be, a PS2 level juggernaut success. At best, I think we could have maybe, if it navigated those Sega navigated those pre-Dreamcast years a bit better. Take on board some of that stuff that we come up with in our Saving the Saturn episode. The Dreamcast would have been better set up. People would have been more receptive, and you probably could get it up to the level of maybe the GameCube or the Xbox, and it might have been able to survive. You could have got to 2004, 2005. Maybe Sega would have been in a better financial position if that's the case, and we could have got a sequel to the Dreamcast. Maybe they would have been the guys that come up with the Wii, and there'd be a juggernaut still like Nintendo are, but none of that happened.
It's just tragic because it's still to this day holds up as a really good console. It's a lot of fun. Absolutely. And it's just, I think that's the most depressing thing. It's not something that failed because it sucked. It was that Sega finally made something amazing and the world didn't care anymore.
Exactly. That's 100% hit the nail on the head. And there's it's probably the best failed console of them all, I would say.
Agreed.
People could say, well, the TurboGrafx 16 was, that had a good few years and it was successful in Japan as the PC engine, so it doesn't count. It's probably a toss-up between that and the Saturn, funnily enough. Two Sega consoles as being the two best failures. So, yeah, it will live on because of that. So at least we've got it still here to experience. People are still making homebrew games, but it is what it is. I don't think it was never going to be saved. I don't think it was already set up by Sega's preceding few years. But we've tried. Maybe we'll go into a different reality and we can time travel and fix that stuff in the future if someone comes up with a time machine. So yeah,
or in the past.
In the past, yeah, exactly. So on that note, Stu, where can you find us on the interwebs?
We're everywhere. We're on Twitter, search Console Shock. We're on Facebook, search Console Shock. We're on the YouTubes, search Console Shock, and any podcast client, search Console Shock.
Cool. And Al, where can you find? Where can we find yourself on the interwebs, and maybe our little podcast that we have together as well?
Yeah, we have a Star Trek podcast that we host together. It's over at longrangesensors.com, and you'll be able to find our main show, Subspace, on all the major podcasting platforms too. And I also have a little nostalgic website which has been on hold for a little bit, but I'm going to be getting back into that soon, which you can find over at nostalgia.zone, and relive some old feeling of old 90s internet.
Which is awesome. Who doesn't want that? We've been talking enough about it today with the Dreamcast. It just gives you a craving to go back and look at it. So check Al's website out if you want to dive back into that era. Well, thank you very much, guys, for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed it. Maybe we've got some thoughts on what you would have done to make the Dreamcast more successful and maybe eke out a bit more success and a few more years out of it than we ultimately got. Leave us a comment in whatever platform that you're watching this on or listening to this on. Otherwise, cheers again for listening, and we'll catch you in the next one. Take care.
Take it easy. Bye-bye.